Custer's Last Stand, full documentary, American Experience. The news reverberated through telegraph lines on July 6, 1876. George Armstrong Custer, along with 261 members of his 7th Cavalry, was annihilated by Cheyenne and Lakota warriors near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. There were no survivors. This event was a shockwave. The West had been claimed. How could such a calamity occur? It is akin to the sinking of the supposedly unsinkable Titanic. It simply defies logic. Across the nation, from bustling cities to quiet towns, the announcement of Custer's demise was met with disbelief and astonishment. It was shocking and remarkable. This was not the anticipated outcome. In Philadelphia, the Centennial International Exhibition, a jubilant celebration of America's centennial, was in full swing. As the nation celebrated its first 100 years, Americans were filled with optimism and pride. The country had endured the Civil War, constructed a transcontinental railroad, and was expanding into the vast interior. Just 2 days after America's joyous birthday celebration, news arrived that Custer, a symbol of the victorious military from the Civil War, of railroad expansion, and of frontier advancement, had been defeated by a group of so-called savages. He represented much of America, embodying not only its noble aspirations, but also many of its darker tendencies. Custer met his end in a dramatic and tragic manner, contributing to the creation of a lasting myth. A well-known poster depicting Custer's Last Stand, produced by Budweiser, was likely displayed in bars across the nation. It illustrated white men encircled by a dark mass, resolute in their refusal to surrender, portraying white men prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in their defense against this adversary. This narrative shaped the perception of the American West for a particular generation, influencing their understanding of the significance of Custer's Last Stand. For those of us raised in the 1950s, embodying George Armstrong Custer represented the epitome of American bravery. The poignant imagery of a final stand features a solitary figure atop a hill, surrounded by fallen comrades, as we all recognize that Custer was the last to fall, akin to Errol Flynn, struck by a bullet and heroically collapsing to the ground. This portrayal encapsulated the essence of American valor and the sacrifices made in warfare. Custer stands as a pivotal figure in the last significant confrontation of the Indian Wars, symbolizing a core dilemma within American history. What is the true value of the progress we have achieved? What sacrifices were necessary for the United States to evolve into its current form? Who bore the burden of those costs? Standing on that battlefield at its highest point, one can still sense the remnants of that conflict. The fear and the fury linger in the air. The echoes of that day remain palpable. On July 3, 1863, near the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the destiny of the Union Army and the trajectory of the Civil War were at a critical juncture. On the third day of this decisive battle, Confederate cavalry led by Jeb Stuart, famed gray horsemen known as the Invincibles, posed a significant threat to the Union's exposed right flank. As the beleaguered Union troops began to retreat, only the seasoned 1st Michigan Cavalry stood ready to mount a counteroffensive. At that crucial moment, a figure emerged at the forefront of the Michigan lines, clad in black velvet, saber raised high, with golden hair billowing in the wind. At the age of 23, Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer led the cavalry into battle. He turned to his men and shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!" The cavalry charged at full speed, the sound of horses echoing as they collided violently. One veteran described the chaos, noting that many horses were flipped end over end, crushing their riders beneath them. The air was filled with the clashing of sabers, the discharge of pistols, demands for surrender, and the cries of combatants. Ultimately, the Union lines held firm, and Custer's audacious charge played a pivotal role in securing a decisive victory in the Civil War. This moment reflects either remarkable bravery or reckless folly, depending on one's perspective. Nonetheless, there was an undeniable drive within him that compelled him to charge into the fray with guns blazing. This was a crucial moment in the Union's triumph at Gettysburg. It was a significant gamble, one that he embraced wholeheartedly. The outcome was favorable. Custer's presence in battle was striking. He exhibited remarkable leadership and composure amidst the turmoil. His innate physical courage was truly inspiring, a rare quality in the chaos of warfare. Custer possessed this gift. He once wrote to a friend expressing his exhilaration, "Oh, could you but have seen some of the charges that we made? While thinking of them, I cannot but exclaim, 'Glorious war!'" George Custer was the firstborn son of a blacksmith who became a farmer in New Rumley, Ohio. From a young age, it was evident that he aspired to rise above his humble beginnings. His self-assurance impressed his congressman, leading to his admission to West Point in 1857, despite his lack of formal qualifications. West Point represented a remarkable opportunity for a young man like Custer to elevate his social standing. It provided a means for him to distance himself from his origins. He always harbored ambitions of greatness, fame, and leaving a lasting impact on the world. West Point was the gateway to fulfilling those aspirations. Custer's future, of course, hinges on his ability to successfully navigate his time at West Point. He demonstrated exceptional aptitude in all the essential skills for a promising career in the cavalry. However, when not mounted, he exhibited a constant defiance towards authority. He exists on the precipice. He possesses a strong desire to belong, yet simultaneously seeks to challenge the boundaries. He aims to be distinctive. He is an adventurer, a risk-taker. By the time he graduated from West Point in June 1861, Custer's record of insubordination had reached unprecedented levels in the Academy's history. Although he graduated at the bottom of his class, he was far from lacking in intelligence. Whenever he faced significant challenges, he would buckle down and find a way to recover. Thus, in one regard, he led a tumultuous, yet exhilarating life. Conversely, there was a genuine sense of discipline present. Despite being newly graduated from West Point at the onset of the war, his actions on the battlefield demonstrated his readiness for leadership. He recognized the opportunity to advance his career during the conflict. He understood that his only asset was his life, compelling him to place himself in perilous situations to make a name for himself. And he did just that. He stood on the front lines alongside his soldiers, enduring the loss of horses beneath him and presenting himself as a target for enemy snipers. His attire was striking, featuring a large sombrero adorned with a feather, a vibrant scarlet neckerchief, and a velvet jacket embellished with gold braid. He was inviting danger. Custer not only embodied the role, he actively performed it. He never requested anything of others that he would not undertake himself. Throughout the most brutal conflict in American history, he remained engaged in combat from the first battle to the last, emerging with only minor injuries. Custer's fortune is truly extraordinary, a notion he himself embraced. Recognized for his valor during his initial engagement at the Battle of Bull Run, Custer quickly made a name for himself through a series of exceptional cavalry maneuvers, earning the admiration of the national press. The New York Tribune asserted that future authors of fiction would find in Brigadier General Custer many of the traits that define a quintessential hero. The soldiers of his Michigan Brigade, many of whom were significantly older than he, revered Custer, following him into some of the war's fiercest battles while proudly donning the bright red neckties he favored. The Civil War era demanded a leader like Custer, one who was audacious, bold, and capable of inspiring those who served under him. It is important to remember that the battlefield during the Civil War was a visual spectacle. A leader had to be a compelling performer, taking center stage in front of his troops to exemplify bravery. The image of Custer, positioned at the forefront with his sword drawn, is the very image that graced the cover of Harper's Weekly and became synonymous with his persona. Following his success at the Battle of Gettysburg, Custer emerged as one of the war's most renowned officers, earning the moniker of the Boy General. He remained on the front lines until the conflict's conclusion, accepting the flag of truce when General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. Custer's most esteemed commander, Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan, presented him with the table on which the peace terms were signed, accompanied by a note addressed to Custer's wife, Libby. It read, "Permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring about this desirable result than your gallant husband." Custer's prominence is notably highlighted by the extensive number of photographs taken of him. He recognized the emerging influence of visual imagery in society and its potential for manipulation. His distinctive costumes and long flowing hair contributed to his cavalier appearance. What is the significance of this portrayal? Primarily, he draws inspiration from popular literature, intertwining the legends of the knight-errant and the cavalier to create a unique persona. He allows his hair to grow long, scents it with cinnamon oil, and takes pride in his youthful good looks and smooth complexion. A key aspect of his appeal lies in his ability to blend feminine and masculine traits, embodying both gentlemanly elegance and ruggedness. Some contemporaries viewed him as resembling a circus performer, while others considered him an oddity. However, for the most part, this image served him well. In the late 19th century, it was essential for public figures to cultivate a theatrical persona, and Custer possessed a distinctly theatrical sensibility. His entrances were designed to capture attention and leave a lasting impression. Following the surrender at Appomattox, Custer faced greater challenges in finding peace than he had encountered in war. Although he had earned a battlefield commission as Major General of Volunteers, he found himself reduced to the rank of captain in the regular army. The post-war military had drastically diminished, shrinking from approximately 1.5 million personnel at the war's conclusion to around 30,000. The officer corps had also contracted significantly, leading to stagnation in promotions, with many officers remaining at their ranks for decades. Custer was no longer leading troops into battle for a noble cause, as the military was undergoing substantial downsizing. During the Civil War, it seemed there was a battle occurring almost daily. A lifestyle that was simply unsustainable came to an abrupt end, leaving him adrift and uncertain of his next steps. In this moment of confusion, he turns to the one individual he relies on most profoundly, the person who holds the greatest sway over him, the foundation of his existence, his wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer. Oh, Audie, we must face death together. A modest life shared is far preferable to the grandest existence lived apart. Must I reiterate to my beloved that she is my everything while I draw breath. Should fate decree my demise, my final prayer will be for her. My last utterance will be her name, and I believe that heaven will not be complete until we are reunited. Their initial encounter took place in the quaint town of Monroe, Michigan, where Custer arrived at the age of 14 to live with his half-sister and attend Stebbins Academy. He returned in the autumn of 1862 as a striking 23-year-old captain serving under General George McClellan, one of Monroe's most eligible bachelors. 3 years younger than Custer, she was affectionately known as Libby, the charming and cultured only daughter of the esteemed judge Daniel Bacon. She was among the most desirable young women at the local seminary. At first, Libby was not particularly taken with Custer, but his determination was unwavering. He declared his intention to marry her from the outset and persistently pursued her. Despite her father's disapproval, she ultimately succumbed to the realization that she was the most significant person in Custer's life. She was an exceptional individual, possessing both beauty and intelligence, qualities that I believe would have attracted Custer. Their relationship was marked by deep passion, which they both romanticized. How precious he is to me. My love for him is profound. His words resonate in my mind, and his kisses linger on my lips. At times, I lose myself completely in thoughts of him. If to love with one's entire being is madness, then I am certainly destined for a lunatic asylum. Together, they projected the image of a dashing cavalier and his lady, a portrayal that delighted Libby as she yearned for a life filled with adventure. Custer's remarkable ascent in the military hierarchy dispelled any doubts Judge Bacon may have harbored regarding their union. The couple wed on February 9, 1864. Following a brief honeymoon, Custer was summoned back to duty, and his new wife promptly made her way to the front lines to join him. Unlike most Army officers' wives, Libby was eager to be present. Consequently, she often found herself in a tent or a residence in close proximity to the ongoing battles. This pattern would persist throughout Custer's career. In her own right, she was a charismatic and steadfast figure. There was a palpable sense that their careers were intertwined endeavors. Libby perceived in Custer a shared ambition for greatness. She aspired to be part of that journey. When the conflict separated them, they corresponded fervently, exchanging letters that sometimes exceeded 20 pages. He affectionately referred to her as my rosebud, my darling sunbeam, or occasionally, my little Durrell. In return, she called him Oddie, a childhood version of his middle name, Armstrong, or dear old standby, and sometimes simply Beau. From the very beginning, they envisioned their lives as inextricably linked. Reflecting on my recent successes and the commendations regarding my conduct and bravery, I believe she will learn of these achievements and take pride in her son. It is important to note that my capacity to love as I do is intrinsically linked to our shared existence. While I do not wish to forfeit my individuality, I aspire to embody the essence of a wife, becoming an integral part of my husband's life. I have never favored the notion of a submissive spouse. Rather, I seek to regard my husband as possessing superior judgment and experience, allowing myself to be guided by him in all matters. Their relationship exemplified a genuine partnership, with her making every effort to support her husband as she truly believed in his potential and recognized that he was contributing to history. In the autumn of 1866, Custer was presented with an opportunity to join the 7th Cavalry, a newly formed regiment destined for the southern plains of Kansas and Oklahoma. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel within the regular army, enabling him to play a significant role in shaping this regiment, which ultimately became his redemption. By mid-October 1866, George, Libby, their cook Eliza, and Custer's pack of staghounds arrived at Fort Riley in northeastern Kansas. At that time, the western frontier was rife with conflict, as railroads extended further westward, accompanied by new waves of settlers. Confrontations with Native Americans on the northern and southern plains escalated. Eastern reformers within the Indian Bureau advocated for a policy of tolerance and accommodation towards the tribes, while those in the West called for their subjugation, if not outright extermination. Like many Army officers, Custer was compelled to navigate this conflicting policy. He and the 7th Cavalry, under the command of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, were tasked with pursuing Cheyenne and Lakota groups that had been raiding the new settlements along the Kansas frontier. Custer ventured into the Indian frontier. The current situation represents the sole active theater of operations. The conflict in which he is engaged has been referred to as Hancock's War, and it is flawed from the outset. This scenario differs significantly from the actions of the Confederates. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho possessed no knowledge of the historical campaigns of figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, nor do they exhibit any interest in them. Custer establishes his camp on elevated terrain to gain a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape and lights large fires. Consequently, the first outcome is that the enemy observes his presence and retreats. What Custer fails to comprehend is that he is embroiled in what is now recognized as a guerrilla warfare scenario. His courage is not in question. Rather, he lacks the opportunity to demonstrate it, as he is unable to locate the enemy and exhibit his bravery in the manner to which he is accustomed. Hancock's campaign extended throughout the summer, during which an increasingly impatient Custer faced a succession of unproductive skirmishes, inconclusive discussions, and relentless rain that left his troops entrenched in deep mud. Custer's frustration mounts. It feels like a futile pursuit. The campaign is poorly managed, yielding no progress. He longs for his wife. His discontent is palpable. The circumstances are vastly different from what he is accustomed to, and the soldiers under his command do not meet the standards he expects. The scope of his operations is significantly reduced. His prolonged separation from Libby weighs heavily on him, and these factors collectively contribute to his decline in composure. While a despondent Libby awaited their return to Fort Riley, Custer's spirits sank further, leading to a decline in morale among his men. During a particularly harsh march along the Republican River, desertion within his regiment became alarmingly blatant, with one group of soldiers leaving the camp in broad daylight. Infuriated, Custer commanded that the deserters be pursued and instructed Major Joel Elliott to ensure that none were brought back alive. Several deserters were killed while others sustained severe injuries. On July 13, 1867, Custer's column arrived at camp near Fort Wallace in a state of disarray. Before his weary troops could recuperate, Custer abruptly ordered 4 officers and 72 men to join him on a grueling 150-mile march to Fort Riley, which lasted for 55 continuous hours. Upon receiving news that Libby had reached a distant fort, he compelled his men to march at an extraordinary pace to reunite with her, leaving behind those who could not keep up or whose horses became incapacitated. At least one soldier was killed by Native Americans, and others were injured. The couple spent merely 24 hours together before Custer had to return to his command. However, an indignant General Hancock ensured that Custer faced a court-martial for abandoning his regiment and for ordering the execution of deserters without trial. This incident marked a peculiar juncture in Custer's career. While he was known for his impulsiveness and risk-taking, he was also driven by ambition, and this may have been the most perilous decision he made regarding his professional future. It appeared that he had lost control and fled from a situation he found unbearable for various reasons. At Fort Leavenworth, Custer mounted a vigorous defense of his actions, addressing each charge. Ultimately, he was found guilty on all counts, suspended from his rank and command, and denied pay for a year. For Libby, the events surrounding this court-martial held a romantic significance. It represented Armstrong's return to her, and she believed that after enduring the arduous march, they would share one perfect day together. She cherished this moment, as it affirmed her belief that she held greater importance than the army itself. He is jeopardizing his entire career, fully aware that this decision is made for her sake. On a personal level, Custer's journey symbolizes their love, while on a professional level, it is disastrous. Custer's initial campaign against the Indians concluded in near total failure. He struggled to locate, let alone engage, the majority of the Indian adversaries. His issues with discipline had fractured his regiment, leaving his career in shambles. Libby stood by her husband. She communicated to a friend back home that he faced the possibility of a court-martial with full knowledge of the repercussions. They were resolute in their decision not to be separated again, even if it meant he would leave the army. which had previously brought them joy. General Sheridan welcomed the couple at Fort Leavenworth for several months, but they eventually returned to a sweltering summer in Monroe. Although George and Libby had each other, it appeared that Custer's once celebrated fortune had finally diminished. In July 1868, following a conflict with a corrupt Indian agent, Cheyenne warriors launched attacks on white settlements along the Kansas frontier, resulting in the deaths of 15 men and the assault of 5 women. Within weeks, the region was once again engulfed in turmoil. To subdue the Indians, General Sherman and Sheridan decided to employ the strategies that had proven effective against the Confederacy in their campaign against the Western tribes. The plan was to strike during the winter when the Cheyenne would be confined to their winter camps, allowing for their capture. Sheridan's approach was unprecedented, bringing the conflict directly to the Cheyenne. Traditionally, Indian raids occurred in the spring and summer, when the grass was lush and their ponies well fed. During the winter months, they took refuge in isolated camps, typically situated near rivers or streams. Historically, the vast expanse of the West had shielded them from their adversaries. However, Sheridan was convinced that his well-equipped troops could track down the Native Americans in their winter encampments. This conflict is merciless. It aims to shatter the resolve of the populace and render them destitute. It brings disease upon them and ultimately breaks their spirit. While Sheridan prepared to implement his audacious strategy, George and Libby remained stranded in Monroe, and Custer's career faced stagnation. He was experiencing significant financial challenges. He was generating a modest income by contributing articles to hunting and outdoor magazines, which constituted nearly all of his means of support. Once a major general of volunteers, he now found himself not only as a lieutenant colonel of his regiment, but also as a suspended lieutenant colonel. The accolades that were being earned were attributed to others. Meanwhile, Libby and George were enduring a prolonged stay in Monroe, Michigan. With several months still remaining on his unpaid leave, Custer received a telegram from Sheridan, who was orchestrating a novel campaign against the Cheyenne. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Custer's career in the West. Sheridan recognized Custer as someone capable of undertaking the grim and arduous tasks associated with Indian warfare. He understood that Custer possessed the vigor, energy, and ambition necessary to achieve the objectives at hand. On November 23, 1868, Custer and his 7th Cavalry departed from their base at Camp Supply in western Oklahoma. Battling through heavy snowfall and frigid temperatures, they embarked on a mission to locate the Native Americans. 3 days later, they discovered the trail of a war party heading south and pursued it until it led them to a Cheyenne village along the banks of the Washita River. Custer was unaware of the number of Native Americans present in the camp or whether they were indeed the hostile warriors he sought, yet he resolved to launch an attack. In the cover of darkness, he segmented his regiment into 4 detachments and instructed them to quietly encircle the village. Subsequently, Custer commanded his men to endure the frigid temperatures until dawn. The tracks led directly to the village of Chief Black Kettle, a figure known for his commitment to peace among the Cheyenne. Following these tracks, Custer made the decision to assault the village. As daylight broke, the cold was so intense that the musicians' instruments froze to their lips. Custer directed his band to play his preferred tune, Gary Oldman. Finally, the lively notes of this spirited melody resonated through the air. One lieutenant recalled the sight of cavalry units surging from all directions, a formidable force eager for glory. They charged into the village through the snow. Gunfire erupted indiscriminately. They shot at anything that moved, women, children, the elderly, and even those who were attempting to flee or surrender. The chaos was overwhelming, resulting in numerous casualties within Black Kettle's village, including the chief himself. The confrontation concluded within minutes, leaving 103 Native Americans dead. While a few were warriors, the majority were elderly individuals, women, and children. To launch an assault at dawn on a village populated primarily by women and children, with only a handful of warriors present, and to engage in indiscriminate killing, as is often seen in such conflicts, is indicative of a troubling new form of warfare. This approach demonstrates a profound disregard for the Indian populace as human beings, with Custer positioned at the center of this strategy. During the chaos, 5 of Custer's soldiers lost their lives, and a dozen more sustained injuries. What Custer fails to recognize is that this village is an anomaly. Just downstream lie several other villages inhabited by a significantly larger number of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians than he anticipated. As the day progresses, these tribes begin to move upriver, becoming aware of the 7th Cavalry's presence. Consequently, Custer must navigate a swift and safe retreat from the Washita. He organizes his troops and directs them toward the other villages as a diversion, which proves effective. The warriors who had been encircling them return to defend their homes. Under the cover of night, Custer then skillfully redirects his forces and heads north toward Fort Supply. This maneuver is arguably one of Custer's most astute military strategies. As they near the fort, Custer arranges his troops in a parade formation, with his Osage scouts leading the way, singing their war songs, followed by 53 captured Cheyenne women and children, all escorted by the 7th Cavalry in formation, their rifles and sabers shimmering in the sunlight. The festivities were overshadowed by the unfortunate news that not all members of the regiment had returned unharmed. Major Joel Elliott and his company were reported missing and presumed dead. During the conflict, Elliott and his men had pursued a group of Cheyenne warriors and subsequently vanished. Faced with the risk of encirclement and the onset of night, Custer opted against launching a search for them. Their remains were discovered several weeks later, mutilated. Some members of the 7th Cavalry believed that Custer had abandoned Elliott and his men, a sentiment that fostered lasting resentment. Among Custer's critics was the regiment's senior captain, Frederick Benteen. He maintained that Elliott and his men had been forsaken in the field, an act he deemed unforgivable. Benteen perceived Custer as primarily concerned with his own image and career advancement, even at the cost of his men's lives. Benteen felt that Custer was taking excessive risks, which deeply troubled him. He believed Custer had deserted Elliott at the Washita, leaving him embittered and creating a significant divide not only between himself and Custer, but also within the entire regiment. The abandonment of Elliott at the Washita would continue to haunt the regiment until the events at Little Bighorn. Some newspapers in the East accused Custer of orchestrating an Indian massacre, yet his glorified narrative prevailed. Custer was celebrated as the preeminent Indian fighter on the plains. This marked the first significant victory against the Plains tribes by the United States Army, and Custer, along with the 7th Cavalry, received accolades throughout the East. The Washita engagement solidified Custer's reputation as an Indian fighter, marking a pivotal transition from his identity as a Civil War general to a figure of celebrity in American culture. The New York Times declared it the most fiercely contested and bloodiest Indian battle in many years. Custer's victory, even if recounted a few times, would bring tranquility to the plains. Although Elliott and his men suffered defeat, Custer's actions at what became known as the Battle of the Washita restored his fame, this time as a celebrated figure of the American frontier. The West would be his refuge. It was on the plains that he could gallop as swiftly as he had during cavalry charges in the Civil War. This new territory was filled with exotic allure, opportunities for exploration, and inherent risks. The frontier's enduring myth stems from its embodiment of potential and the quest for self-identity. The narrative of the West was one that resonated with all who identified as part of the United States. It represented a tale of nation-building and territorial expansion. Custer recognized that the West was poised to be the stage for the next significant conflict. He was convinced of his own destiny for greatness, a belief he held deeply. His aspiration was to achieve lasting renown. Having risen from the ruins of a court-martial, Custer claimed a remarkable victory, at least in his own account, and envisioned a promising future ahead. This tale rapidly circulated among various groups across the northern plains. Near the Yellowstone River in Montana, a contingent of warriors found themselves in a standoff with a surveying team from the Northern Pacific Railroad. In a surprising move, a chief named Sitting Bull called out, inviting anyone who wished to smoke with him to join, and he began to approach the enemy lines. 4 of his men accompanied him, sitting down to smoke amidst the chaos of flying bullets. He remained calm, observing his surroundings and smoking peacefully, as his nephew White Bull recalled, while others anxiously puffed on the pipe, their hearts racing. Upon completion of his task, with dust rising from the bullets striking the ground near him, Sitting Bull meticulously cleaned his pipe using a stick before making his way back to his people at a deliberate pace. White Bull regarded this act as the epitome of courage. As the leader of the Hunkpapa band of the Teton Sioux, or Lakota, he was celebrated not only for his prowess as a warrior, but also for his prophetic visions. Sitting Bull's influence and ascent to leadership were deeply rooted in his spirituality, which granted him profound visions. Observing Sitting Bull, particularly his gaze, reveals the depth of his spirit. He exemplified leadership through his actions. His legacy of valor, combined with his charisma and spiritual depth, made him the embodiment of the qualities the Lakota required during a tumultuous period marked by the encroachment of white civilization. Just months prior to the Battle of the Washita in 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, which included a significant portion of what is now South Dakota, along with vast hunting territories to the north and west, notably the Black Hills. The Black Hills represented a vital source of life for the Lakota. It was not only a provider of sustenance, but also a site of profound sacredness. It was where they were born, lived, and ultimately passed away, deserving of their utmost reverence. Numerous sacred sites existed within the Black Hills, serving as the spiritual backbone of the Lakota people, a place integral to their creation story. Sitting Bull referred to the Black Hills as the food pack, symbolizing a source of sustenance carried along on life's journey, representing reserves for their existence. According to the treaty, these lands were to be permanently allocated to the Sioux. In exchange, they were expected to abandon hostilities towards the Americans and coexist peacefully, receiving provisions from government agencies located on the reservation. The majority of the tribe chose to follow a particular path, yet Sitting Bull stood firm in his defiance, refusing to recognize the treaty, much less endorse it. He and his followers, whom General Phillips labeled as hostiles, continued to travel alongside the buffalo herds as they had traditionally done, often engaging in conflicts with railroad workers and white settlers. This unrest on the reservations was exacerbated by their efforts to entice other Native Americans away from the agencies each summer for buffalo hunting. Sitting Bull and his followers categorically rejected the idea of entering the agencies. They adhered to conservative values, both socially and spiritually, committed to preserving their ancestral way of life. Sitting Bull held nothing but contempt for the Sioux who opted for life on the reservations. "You are foolish to enslave yourselves for a mere piece of bacon, some hardtack, and a bit of sugar and coffee," he declared. "The whites may ultimately capture me, but I will enjoy my freedom until that day comes." For the time being, Sitting Bull remained a steadfast symbol of resistance for his people. However, General Sheridan perceived that a day of reckoning was imminent. Throughout Sitting Bull's rise, Custer endeavored to maintain his visibility in the public sphere. He orchestrated high-profile buffalo hunts on the Kansas plains, led a railroad survey expedition deep into Lakota territory, and penned a series of articles detailing his adventures for Galaxy magazine. Then, on a cold November evening in 1873, the Custers arrived at their new assignment, Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. After being dispersed and assigned to peacekeeping roles throughout the South, the 7th Cavalry was finally being reunited to extend American influence over the northern plains. Fort Lincoln was to become the regiment's and the Custers' first genuine home. Situated on elevated terrain along the western bank of the Missouri River, just south of Bismarck, the fort was established to safeguard the crews engaged in the construction of the Northern Pacific Railroad. In the subdued illumination, I could discern the prominent structure of Fort Lincoln, where only a few months prior we had departed from a desolate expanse. Our quarters were aglow, and as we drew near, the regimental band performed Home Sweet Home, followed by the General's preferred tune, Gary Owen. The General had fully prepared the residents, yet he had kept this information concealed as a delightful surprise. Our acquaintances had illuminated the space and kindled fires in the hearths. It seemed almost unbelievable that the 7th Cavalry possessed a post of its own. He and Libby maintained a pleasant headquarters. They hosted gatherings featuring musical evenings. They also organized theatrical performances. They offered entertainment and a vibrant social life for the officers stationed under their command at the fort. They were charming and engaging. They were regarded as celebrities. It was a time filled with joy. A significant aspect of this idyllic setting was its familial nature. He had in many respects transformed the environment of his upbringing. His younger brother Tom was present, and his sister Maggie was married to Lieutenant Calhoun. Boston Custer, the youngest of the Custer siblings, would soon join them, creating a true Custer enclave in the northern plains of North Dakota. Custer enjoyed being surrounded by those who cared for him. It resembled a small microcosm of society with Custer at its heart. However, not every member of the 7th Cavalry was embraced within Custer's favored circle, which one new lieutenant referred to as the Royal Family. Officers who exhibited little patience for Custer's self-importance, such as Frederick Benteen and the regiment's senior officer, Major Marcus Reno, were relegated to more remote postings in the territory. Yet, if the rifts within the 7th Cavalry troubled Custer, he did not allow it to be apparent. One was. One visitor expressed their delight at being welcomed into what they described as the most joyful home they had ever encountered, a place where love and trust flourished in perfect harmony. Libby's aspirations matched those of Custer, yet as a woman in the 19th century, she had to adopt a more subtle approach, viewing her endeavors as extensions of her husband's ambitions. Libby possessed a keen political insight, a higher social intelligence, and an ability to read people effectively, while Custer was simply Custer. He excelled at interpreting situations during battle, but in everyday interactions, he often overlooked important nuances. Consequently, Libby frequently found herself advising him, urging, "Now wait a moment, George. Are you certain you wish to express that?" They were indeed regarded as the prominent couple of their era. George and Libby Custer were youthful and attractive, yet childless, which led to the expectation that they would eventually have children, a hope that remained unfulfilled. Despite Libby's strong desire for a large family, both she and George ultimately sought to find positives in their situation. George reassured Libby by suggesting that having children would only complicate their lives, stating that their enjoyment would be perpetually hindered. They projected an image of domestic bliss, yet numerous signs indicated that their marriage faced challenges. Custer had a penchant for card games and gambling, embracing risk, which raises questions about the ease of their marital relationship at times. During his regular visits to New York and Washington, Custer was open about his nightlife, often mingling with socialites and opera singers. His letters from New York frequently mentioned other women with whom he spent time, suggesting a somewhat immature desire to showcase the admiration he received from them to his wife. The couple experienced a separation during the Christmas season of 1869, the reasons for which remain unclear. George communicated to Libby through a letter expressing his desire for her to temper her anger, assuring her that she held no significance for him. At times, she would refrain from writing to him entirely, leading him to plead for correspondence. The nadir of their marriage occurred in December 1870, when Custer found himself alone, resulting in them spending Christmas apart for the second consecutive year. In response, he penned a lengthy and remorseful letter to Libby, vowing to abstain from playing cards in the future. He also addressed his own inexcusable actions, expressing concern that he had jeopardized the most meaningful relationship he had ever experienced. The reconciliations between them were marked by deep emotion and romance, indicating a mutual need for one another. On July 2, 1874, as his band performed the regimental battle song, Gary Owen, Custer and the 7th Cavalry departed westward from Fort Lincoln on an expedition to the Black Hills. Libby was not part of this journey. Ultimately, she received word from Indian scouts that the summer could be fraught with peril, which left her heartbroken at the realization that the general felt compelled to leave her behind. The expedition was officially aimed at scouting a new site for a fort, enabling Sheridan to exert greater control over the so-called hostiles within the reservation. While the United States government publicly upheld the Lakota's rights to the Black Hills, privately, Washington was intent on instigating a conflict with Sitting Bull and facilitating a surge of white settlement that would render the Fort Laramie Treaty ineffective. It is widely recognized that this expedition was designed to generate public interest in the appropriation of the Black Hills. Custer's role extended beyond mere exploration. He was also tasked with promoting the discovery, making it a significant undertaking. 1,000 soldiers accompanied by 110 wagons, along with 70 Indian scouts, geologists, botanists, 4 newspaper reporters, and notably 2 miners searching for potential mineral deposits, comprised the Black Hills expedition. This mission was exceptionally suited to Custer's capabilities, resembling a circus where he assumed the role of the ringmaster. This grand setting provided Custer with a significant platform, which he skillfully utilized. Over the ensuing weeks, as the extensive wagon train journeyed south and east through the Black Hills, Custer seemed to be omnipresent. My dearest Sunbeam, your devoted admirer, is unable to compose a lengthy letter, despite having much to convey. After dinner, upon reaching camp, I typically take an escort to scout several miles of the road for the next day's journey. Upon my return, I am eager to retreat to my comfortable, albeit solitary, bed. Reveille is consistently at 2:45, breakfast at 4, and we are in the saddle by 5. We have uncovered a rich and stunning landscape. Custer possesses an uncontainable, restless energy, making this expedition ideal for him, as it provided ample opportunities to explore his diverse interests and hobbies under the watchful gaze of accompanying reporters. He was engaged in self-taught taxidermy, collecting specimens dispatched to major repositories across the nation. After shooting a bear, he posed for a photograph in a buckskin outfit, presenting himself as a frontier hero to a public familiar with the novels of James Fenimore Cooper. This image held significant impact. Custer effectively utilized the Black Hills expedition as a platform to enhance his public persona. Throughout their nearly 4 weeks in the Black Hills, the men encountered surprisingly few signs of hostile Indians, and gradually the expedition took on a more leisurely atmosphere. He characterizes the Black Hills as a paradise on earth. A particularly striking scene depicts a cavalryman traversing meadows filled with wildflowers and tall grasses, which rise so high that the horses appear to be wading through them. Throughout the expedition, Custer diligently composes official reports, fully aware that they will be extensively quoted in newspapers. Consequently, newspapers from the East Coast and Chicago are drawing heavily from his accounts, which catapults Custer back into the public eye. The headline that captures widespread attention and places Custer at the forefront of public discourse is a single four-letter word: gold. The initial discovery of gold occurred at French Creek on July 30th, 1874. The Chicago Inter-Ocean proclaimed it as pay dirt, while the Bismarck Tribune suggested that Custer's find could potentially become America's El Dorado. Custer articulates a compelling notion when he states, "We found gold among the roots of the grass." This phrase conjures an image of a farmer who, upon plowing the land, first uncovers gold, deposits it in the bank, and then sows his wheat. The announcement of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 coincides with a period of economic depression in the United States. As a result, those who can afford the necessary equipment set out for the Black Hills in search of fortune. The U.S. government's stance is that this influx of miners will lead to an invasion of the territory, inevitably resulting in conflict with Native Americans. Custer returned to Fort Lincoln on August 30th, 1874, amidst a wave of favorable media coverage regarding his expedition. However, William Curtis, a correspondent for the New York World, harbored a foreboding sense about the journey. The author expressed that the invasion of sacred lands is driving the indigenous peoples to a state of frenzy prior to the commencement of the expedition. This act also opens pathways for them to seek a formidable retribution. While Custer was stationed on the plains, he contributed articles to a sportsman's magazine focusing on hunting. He adopted the pseudonym Nomad during this time. It was also a period when he began to contemplate and discuss his adversaries, the Native Americans, stating that if he were in their position, he would align himself with those currently opposing him, yearning for a life of freedom and exploration. Custer exemplified a complex duality in his perception of indigenous peoples. He maintained a conflicted relationship with them, feeling a strong connection and taking pride in his understanding of their customs and way of life. At times he embraced and emulated their culture, yet he simultaneously belonged to white society, viewing them as a primitive race destined to fade into obscurity. The narrative is heavily marked by violence, as the brutal dispossession of indigenous peoples was seen as a means to fulfill the American destiny. This legacy is fraught with turmoil, making it difficult to take pride in the triumph over a people who pose no threat other than their mere presence. By the autumn of 1875, just over a year following Custer's expedition to the Black Hills, more than 15,000 miners had descended upon the area, leading to the establishment of the towns of Custer and Deadwood. The government proposed to purchase the Black Hills for $6 million, a proposition that the Lakota rejected. Individuals from Sitting Bull's camps descended and issued threats against any chief who would sign the agreement. Historically, the government had established treaties with Native Americans, which typically lasted for a decade or two, often spanning a generation. However, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills necessitated a more rapid abrogation of these agreements. The government's pursuit of the Black Hills inadvertently aligned with Sitting Bull's objectives. He sought to unify his people in response to the encroaching threat from the east. Sitting Bull resolved not to engage in negotiations with the United States government and continued to enlist Native Americans willing to join him for summer hunting expeditions. His aim was to foster a Lakota resistance against this invasion. On November 3rd, President Ulysses Grant convened a meeting with his senior cabinet members and military leaders to deliberate on the administration's policy towards Native Americans. Although constrained by the stipulations of the Fort Laramie Treaty, Grant and his generals were intent on dismantling one of the last bastions of Native American resistance in the West, leading to two significant decisions. They chose not to impede the influx of white miners into the Black Hills and issued an ultimatum. Any Lakota or Cheyenne who did not report to the agencies by the end of January 1876 would be deemed hostile, and military force would be employed to compel their compliance. Sheridan would later regard this situation as somewhat amusing. The demand for them to enter the reservations amidst the harsh winter conditions of the northern plains was utterly absurd. This approach was essentially escalating the conflict, creating a covert war that advanced the objectives of American imperialism. There is no other perspective from which to view this situation. A strategic plan was devised to compel the Lakota to relinquish the Black Hills. Custer emerged as the obvious candidate to spearhead this initiative, and the timing was fortuitous. At the age of 36, he was no longer in the prime of youth, and while much of his vigor was directed towards achieving another triumph against the Native Americans, one that he anticipated would earn him a sought-after promotion to brigadier general, he and Libby intended to spend a significant portion of the winter of 1875 on the East Coast, exploring alternative avenues to secure their future. Custer is currently contemplating his next steps. He finds himself in New York, seeking connections with influential individuals. He mingles with affluent socialites, including actors and actresses. This is the elite circle he navigates, characterized by wealth, sophistication, and authority. Yet he feels somewhat detached from it. Despite his renown and the accolades he had accumulated in his relatively short life, he had not achieved any substantial financial stability. He yearns for the financial security that comes with tangible wealth, as fame alone does not provide sustenance. He confides in Libby that his aspiration is to return to New York, amass wealth, and reside in a mansion on Fifth Avenue. He is in pursuit of business opportunities. Although he has proven to be a poor businessman, he remains hopeful that the next venture might lead to significant success. Regrettably, he is also engaging in gambling, resulting in considerable financial losses. He is facing financial difficulties, having invested in precarious stock options and unprofitable silver mines, bringing him to the brink of financial disaster. The expedition to the Black Hills is now a couple of years behind him, and little progress has been made since. Custer had pinned his aspirations on a potentially lucrative lecture tour he had organized with the Red Path Speakers Bureau. In a letter to his brother Tom in January, he remarked that the terms would astonish him. "They encouraged me to begin this spring, but I declined as I required additional time for preparation." Subsequently, in late March, while he was preparing his regiment for the upcoming campaign, Custer was summoned to Washington. He testified before a congressional committee that sought to undermine the Grant administration's management of contracts at Indian agencies on the frontier. Custer's testimony largely consisted of hearsay. However, he did manage to accuse the president's brother, Orville, of engaging in influence peddling. This infuriated Grant, who resolved to keep Custer sidelined. In an attempt to make amends, Custer sought to visit the White House to apologize to Grant, but the president refused to meet with him. In response, Grant removed Custer from command of the 7th Cavalry, stating that he could not pursue Sitting Bull. For Custer, this was a significant blow. He found himself on the brink of what could have been his final campaign to achieve the glory that would bring him numerous honors, only to be thwarted by this testimony, with the President of the United States now opposing him. Custer was left to implore Grant for the preservation of his career. "I appeal to you as a soldier," he wrote to the President, "to spare me the humiliation of witnessing my regiment march to confront the enemy while I am unable to share in its perils." Grant remained unyielding. However, both Sheridan and Brigadier General Alfred Terry were eager to have Custer in the field. Ultimately, it was General Terry who intervened on Custer's behalf. Although Terry was not an Indian fighter and had primarily served as an administrator, he recognized that Custer was likely his best option for effective leadership and achieving the objectives of his department. He assisted Custer in composing a letter that advocated for his reinstatement, albeit with the stipulation that Terry would command the column. Custer resembled a mischievous child, perpetually in trouble at school, yet his charm and smile often extricated him from difficult situations. Thus, in 1876, he embarked westward once more, seeking both redemption and glory. Custer achieved remarkable success at a young age, and the traits that contributed to his accomplishments, his audacity and flamboyance, were emblematic of youth. Throughout his life, he harbored a persistent anxiety that time was against him. He feared that if he did not secure lasting glory by a certain age, the opportunity would elude him forever. He was a man poised to take significant risks. Custer's closest companion was a Shakespearean actor named Lawrence Barrett, who during the winter of 1876 was performing as Cassius in Julius Caesar in New York. Custer had a profound appreciation for the theater. As his wife Libby noted, he experienced plays with childlike wonder, shedding tears during poignant moments and laughing heartily during joyous scenes. The conclusion of Julius Caesar is particularly compelling, featuring Cassius and Brutus, who have assassinated Caesar for the sake of Rome. As they face the onslaught of Caesar's loyalist Mark Antony, they find themselves in a life-or-death struggle, ultimately deciding to take their own lives. Brutus, with whom Custer likely resonated, declares, "I shall have glory by this losing day." During that winter, Custer attended performances of Julius Caesar at least 40 times. On May 10, 1876, as General Terry and a humbled Custer arrived in Bismarck to prepare the 7th Cavalry for their westward journey, President Grant officiated the opening of the Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia. This grand event featured over 200 buildings showcasing numerous exhibits, including a massive Corliss steam engine, a new condiment called Heinz Ketchup, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Over 186,000 individuals attended the event. The Philadelphia Centennial Celebration represents a remarkable occasion, attracting Americans from various regions to witness it. The atmosphere is filled with advanced technology, embodying a vibrant and optimistic vision of the future, all while celebrating the conclusion of the Civil War. There is a prevailing belief that Native Americans do not pose any significant threat to this advancing American future. Custer is aware of the exposition and recognizes that a victory during this event would serve as an impressive backdrop for his reputation. Such a triumph would likely result in extensive media coverage and public admiration following his anticipated success against the Sioux and Cheyenne. On May 17th, the 7th Cavalry departed from Fort Abraham Lincoln, heading westward. Grant's ultimatum had elapsed, yet Sitting Bull and his group remained at large. Terry and Custer received orders to either compel them onto the reservation or eliminate them in the process. Libby later reflected on the numerous long campaigns the men had embarked upon over the past 7 years on the plains, noting that this particular mission felt different and potentially grave. Unable to remain behind, she joined the regiment on its initial day of march. Riding close to the front alongside her husband, she turned to observe the column and witnessed a remarkable sight. As the sun pierced through the mist, a mirage emerged, encompassing nearly half of the cavalry line, and for a brief distance it appeared to march in unison, both visible on the ground and in the sky. This phenomenon seemed to foreshadow a supernatural transformation as their forms blended into the ethereal. The early dawn's opaque mist reflected various images. She reassures herself with the belief that Custer's fortune has consistently favored him. He appears untroubled by the circumstances. He anticipates returning in the summer, hoping for shared moments together. He looks forward to engaging in the lecture circuit and generating income. Ultimately, he leads his men away, rising in the stirrups. He turned back, waved to her, and that marked the last time she ever saw him. The 7th Cavalry comprised 670 soldiers, organized into 12 companies, each under the command of a captain, along with a company of guides, interpreters, and Indian scouts, primarily from the Crow and Arikara tribes, who had historically been adversaries of the Lakota and had allied with the Americans. Custer's staff included his adjutant, Lieutenant William Cook, his brother Tom, serving as aide-de-camp, his other brother Boston as a guide, and his nephew, Audie Reed, who accompanied them as a civilian. Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, was among the company commanders. The younger officers were firmly loyal to Custer, often dressing in buckskin like him, and while they may not have idolized him, they would follow him anywhere. However, there was always Benteen and a few officers who did not regard Custer as the ultimate solution to every problem. This dynamic created a constant tension within the 7th Cavalry. One individual who was not included in Custer's inner circle was Major Reno. With an unremarkable record from the Civil War, a somber demeanor, and a penchant for whiskey, Reno harbored aspirations of leading the 7th Cavalry, yet his opportunity for distinction had eluded him. The Arikara referred to him as the man with the dark face, which aptly described him. A shadow seemed to follow him, and he perpetually appeared to be seeking a way to rectify a lingering wrong that had troubled him throughout his life. General Terry devised a strategy for the Army to deploy 3 separate columns. He and Custer would command 1,200 soldiers from Fort Lincoln, advancing westward, while Colonel John Gibbon would lead 440 troops marching east from Montana. Additionally, General George Crook was tasked with directing 1,100 men north from Wyoming. The objective for all 3 columns was to converge in the vicinity of the Upper Yellowstone and its northward tributaries, including the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn Rivers, where it was believed the Native Americans were encamped. A steamboat stationed further west was scheduled to rendezvous with the troops on the Yellowstone River to deliver supplies. Terry's overarching strategy for the campaign involved these 3 converging columns entering Sitting Bull's territory. The intention was not for the columns to launch a simultaneous attack. Rather, the hope was that one column would force the Native Americans towards another. Concerns primarily revolved around the possibility of the Indians evading capture, with little attention given to their numbers. Once on the trail, Custer exhibited a buoyant demeanor. Despite Terry's instructions to remain with the main group, he and his brothers frequently ventured off on spontaneous hunting and exploration excursions. Almost immediately after the march commenced, Custer sought every opportunity to deviate from the column. He and his brothers reveled in their adventures across the plains, which increasingly exasperated Terry. Eventually, Terry admonished Custer, insisting that he must stay with the column. By June 9th, the expedition had progressed along the Yellowstone River to its junction with the Powder River. Terry, perhaps seeking to reprimand Custer for his frivolous behavior, assigned Major Reno and half of the regiment to venture southward into the Powder River Basin in pursuit of Sitting Bull's band. The choice to appoint Reno as the leader took the rest of the regiment by surprise. One lieutenant noted in his journal that there was much speculation among the officers regarding why General Custer was not in command, yet no consensus had been reached. Custer was tasked with guiding the remainder of the regiment toward a designated meeting point. During their journey, they stumbled upon an abandoned Lakota winter camp, where it was estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of Lakota had resided during the winter months. There, Custer discovered evidence of a soldier who had seemingly suffered a brutal death, having been beaten, tortured, and ultimately burned. Upon observing the skull, Custer appeared visibly affected. It was at this moment that they set up camp adjacent to the Indian burial ground, and Custer seemed to harbor a desire for vengeance. He, along with his brothers and several other officers, engaged in a systematic desecration of the burial site, taking pleasure in their actions. They later corresponded about the spoils they had acquired. However, for some officers and soldiers, this behavior was deeply disturbing. 4 days later, Reno returned to the regiment with thrilling news. Defying his orders and surpassing all expectations, he had crossed over to the Rosebud and discovered a significant trail that could only have been created by Sitting Bull's village. Reno had tracked the signs for several miles, but as his supplies dwindled, he ultimately chose to turn back and reunite with the main column. Custer was infuriated. He remarked to Reno, questioning why he did not pursue the village upon seeing it. He perceived this as an indication of cowardice, a sentiment often held by military personnel. If one anticipated a significant victory, even if it contradicted orders, the expectation was to act decisively. After some contemplation, Reno ultimately chose not to chase the Lakota. Custer found this decision incomprehensible. That evening, feeling deeply insulted by Reno's caution, Custer composed an anonymous letter to the New York Herald, challenging Reno's bravery. He wrote, "A faint heart never won a fair lady, nor did it ever pursue a retreating Indian village." On June 21st, at the junction of the Yellowstone and the Rosebud Rivers, Terry convened his officers in his cabin on the far west and presented his revised strategy. Major Marcus Reno was excluded from this meeting. Terry instructed Custer to follow the Indian trail that Reno had discovered, but instead of pursuing it directly, he was to loop southward to allow for a convergence with Gibbon from the north. Custer was a known entity. His capabilities were well understood. The notion that he would delay for a day and a half while Terry and the rest of the column positioned themselves was seen as ludicrous. Terry's strategy was to ensure that, should the operation succeed, he would be in an advantageous position for a significant victory. Conversely, if the situation deteriorated, he would have the justification that Custer had disobeyed orders in his assault on the Indians, a scenario they all anticipated. Terry was fully aware that if he allowed Custer the freedom to act, Custer would locate the Indians and engage them. Custer did not merely slip his constraints, they were intentionally released, and he surged forward with the enthusiasm of a wolfhound on a scent. He was moving at full speed, unstoppable in his pursuit, a fact recognized by all. That is the reason for his presence. As noted in Gibbon's Chief of Scouts' diary, should Custer arrive first, he is authorized to launch an immediate attack if he considers it wise. He will certainly strive to reach the location ahead of others to claim the glory for himself and his regiment. The prevailing belief regarding engagements with the Plains Indians was that they lacked proficiency in combat. Specifically, it was thought they would not engage in direct confrontation, rather they would harass from a distance, hold their ground momentarily, and then disperse. The military strategy of the time involved charging into villages from multiple directions. Given the absence of a command structure among the Indians, they would be uncertain about where to retreat or how to confront the attackers, leading to demoralization and eventual flight or surrender. Consequently, a smaller cavalry unit should be capable of overcoming a significantly larger Indian force. On June 22nd, Custer and his regiment, accompanied by a convoy of mules laden with supplies and ammunition, bid farewell to Terry and Gibbon. As they departed, Gibbon called out, urging Custer not to be greedy and to leave some for them. Custer responded firmly, stating that he would not. 5 days prior to Custer's departure, General George Crook and his Wyoming column were enjoying a respite along the Rosebud River. Suddenly, a substantial contingent of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors emerged from the mountains. Crook's troops fought valiantly to defend themselves against relentless waves of attackers. The courageous efforts of their Crow and Shoshone scouts were instrumental in preventing the Wyoming column from being overwhelmed. The following day, a rattled Crook retreated southward. This marked the first time he had faced such a bold and sustained assault from the Indians throughout an entire day. He eventually relayed a report to General Sheridan in Chicago, but did not inform Terry of the events that transpired. A significant shift was occurring within the Lakota and Cheyenne populations, as they rallied in support of Sitting Bull, who had issued a call for their participation. This summer may mark our final season on the plains. The buffalo population is abundant, and their activities are impacting the Black Hills. Come forth. Individuals are beginning to rally around Sitting Bull. Many are departing from reservations to unite, forming a collective force aimed at resisting this encroachment and imminent danger. Consequently, a sense of urgency emerged. Warriors joined forces, coming together in solidarity. They began to assemble in increasing numbers. Before long, the Little Bighorn Valley was alive with activity, hosting a vast herd of ponies numbering in the thousands. Not only were there hundreds of individuals, but the great camp circles were filled with thousands upon thousands of people, potentially representing the largest congregation of native peoples in the history of the northern plains. For Sitting Bull's followers, there was no avenue for escape. There was nowhere to retreat. This is the moment. It represents the last significant stand for the Lakota homeland. On June 23rd, Custer's column discovered the trail leading to Sitting Bull's village and commenced its pursuit. "There are many of them," Custer remarked to his orderly, John Berkman, noting that their numbers exceeded expectations. When Berkman inquired if there were too many, Custer responded with a smile, stating, "What the 7th cannot defeat, the entire U.S. Army cannot defeat." Concerned that Sitting Bull's band might disperse, Custer urged his men onward, marching through the night of June 24th until his weary troops collapsed on the eastern slope of a divide in the Wolf Mountains. Custer hoped that beyond this divide lay Sitting Bull's village. If he and his troops remained unnoticed, if they could encircle the village, and if they could leverage their element of surprise, Custer might finally achieve the victory he so urgently sought. Shortly after dawn on the 25th, Custer ascended to a vantage point known as the Crow's Nest. The village was not visible from this location due to the misleading nature of the terrain. However, in the valley of the Little Bighorn, a significant plume of smoke was observable. The Crows were the first to acknowledge the presence of a large number of Native Americans, claiming there were more Indians than the military had ammunition. Custer expressed skepticism regarding the existence of a village, asserting that his eyesight was keen and he could not see it. Eventually, he became persuaded that, although the village was not directly visible, this day would indeed be significant. Shortly thereafter, he received reports of several Sioux spotted near the patch of rain, trailing the cavalry, which immediately raised his concerns about their discovery. His troops were fatigued from several days of marching and were on the verge of engaging in a battle against unforeseen odds. Just after noon on June 25th, Custer organized his regiment into battalions, retaining 5 companies, approximately 200 men, under his direct command. Meanwhile, Reno and Benteen led battalions consisting of 3 companies each. Custer surrounded himself with his loyal supporters, ensuring that his inner circle accompanied him. This arrangement meant that the critical forces necessary for diverting the village's attention and assisting in the encirclement were commanded by 2 individuals with whom he shared a profound bond. Major Marcus Reno and Frederick Benteen harbored mutual animosity. Custer advanced, tracing the path toward the village that followed a small stream known as Sundance Creek. His scouts indicated that the Indians in the village were beginning to disperse, confirming his greatest apprehension. Custer split his forces, directing Benteen toward some hills on the left in an effort to block the Indians' escape to the southwest. Observing dust rising ahead and fearing the Indians were indeed scattering, Custer commanded Reno to launch an attack, assuring him of support. Subsequently, Custer turned right toward a series of high bluffs, intending to encircle the village and strike from the north. Upon reaching the summit of the bluffs, he beheld the vast village spread out before him, appearing vulnerable. Custer dispatched a message to Benteen, urging him to hurry. "Benteen, come on, big village, come quick, bring packs, bring packs." With his hat raised, he exclaimed, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them. We will finish them off and then return to our station." He instructed Reno to charge into the village. Reno crossed the Little Bighorn River and advanced with just over 100 men down the valley. As they approached, the village remained out of sight, but signs of Indian presence were evident. Reno's battalion continued to push forward until they rounded a bend in the creek, revealing Sitting Bull's teepees. A small group of warriors emerged to confront them. Abruptly, Reno commanded his men to stop and dismount. They formed a firing line and commenced shooting into the village. He became increasingly convinced that Custer had effectively sent him into an ambush. By deploying the skirmish line, he was essentially applying the brakes to the situation. Unfortunately, the fear and panic that had been directed toward the village began to reverse direction. Observing the hesitation of Reno's men, a mounted Sitting Bull dispatched his nephew and another warrior to ascertain whether the soldiers would be open to negotiation. However, they were met with gunfire and sustained serious injuries. Tragically, Sitting Bull's prized horse was also killed in the exchange. "My best horse has been shot," he lamented. "It feels as though I have been struck myself. We must attack them." An increasing number of warriors surged from the village, prompting the outnumbered soldiers to retreat in a state of panic toward a cluster of trees by the river. The soldiers were ill-prepared for this confrontation. They were fatigued from riding throughout the night. Faced with the fierce appearance of the Indians, adorned in war paint, the soldiers were gripped by fear. Their normal composure was shattered, and they were acutely aware of the threat posed by the approaching tribes. The Indians capitalized on this fear, observing the warriors darting through the woods. The cacophony of battle was overwhelming. The whistles, the screams, and the gunfire created a chaotic atmosphere. The arrows raining down through the trees added to the terror of the moment. The temperature soared above 90 degrees, and the air was thick with gunpowder. Amidst the chaos, there were cries of anguish, and women sang songs of praise on the battlefield. At one point, Bloody Knife, Custer's favored Iroquois scout, was alongside Reno as they attempted to regroup their forces. While Reno communicated with him using sign language, a sudden shot rang out, striking Bloody Knife in the back of the head, splattering his blood and brains onto Reno's face. This incident appeared to be the breaking point for Reno. His confusion was evident as he alternated between instructing the troopers to mount and dismount, leading to a complete breakdown of order. Reno's conduct can be largely attributed to his consumption of whiskey during the charge down the valley, which certainly did not aid the situation. With his face smeared in blood, Reno raised his pistol and shouted, "Anyone who wishes to survive, follow me." He then proceeded to ride out of the timber, hastily making his way toward the river, driven by the pressure from the Indians. Despite the riverbank being nearly 10 feet high, the soldiers leaped into the water, only to discover a narrow cut in the bank on the opposite side that permitted passage for only one individual at a time, creating a significant bottleneck. In their panic, some soldiers discarded their weapons in a desperate attempt to escape. After a long day of riding, their horses were exhausted, while the Indian ponies remained vigorous. The Indians likened the situation to a buffalo hunt. Those who managed to survive eventually ascended to the bluffs, visibly shaken by their ordeal as they emerged from the valley. Upon reaching the top of the hill, Reno encountered Captain Benteen. "For God's sake, Benteen," he implored, "halt your command and assist me. I have lost half of my men." Benteen hesitated and inquired, "Where is Custer?" Reno's men had witnessed Custer waving his hat from the bluffs before he vanished from sight. Although Benteen had received urgent orders from Custer to advance quickly, both he and Reno remained stationary, engaged in conversation without taking any action. Meanwhile, gunfire erupted to the north beyond an intervening bluff, as all the warriors surged in that direction. For over an hour and a half, Reno and Benteen remained inactive, essentially doing nothing. The discussion revolves around Custer, with Benteen invoking the memory of Major Joel Elliott. He expresses his understanding of Custer's actions, suggesting that, once again, Custer has departed, leaving them vulnerable, much like Major Joel Elliott, which may lead to their own demise. At this critical juncture, the specter of the Washita emerges, resulting in Custer being isolated from the other battalions. Eventually, Captain Weir, a close associate of Custer, becomes increasingly frustrated by the inaction and the sounds of gunfire emanating from the north. He resolves to venture out independently, which seems to spur Benteen into action. They ascend a prominent hill and gaze northward, where they observe plumes of smoke and dust. They witness what appears to be Native Americans firing into the ground, followed by a gathering of warriors forming a formidable wave as they advance toward them. Recognizing the imminent threat, they understand the necessity to retreat and secure a position for a final stand. Over the subsequent 36 hours, Reno, Benteen, and 400 soldiers and scouts would fend off an overwhelming force of more than 2,000 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. As the sun set on June 26th, the weary men beheld the sight of Sitting Bull's entire village, comprising 8,000 individuals and 20,000 horses, beginning their southward exodus. The moment Sitting Bull decided to relocate must have been a remarkable spectacle. The scene would have been filled with the sounds of barking dogs, the resonance of war songs, and the cries of those mourning their losses. In contrast, the cavalry lacked the fervor and spirit for battle, while Sitting Bull and his warriors were driven by a profound sense of purpose. The land belonged to them. It represented their final stand. Their motivations for fighting were fundamentally different to some degree. They were battling for their very existence. They were defending their way of life. The following day, General Terry and Colonel Gibbon finally reached the battlefield. A lieutenant reported the discovery of 197 bodies scattered across the hills. Terry ascended the hill, where Benteen was among the first to inquire about Custer's whereabouts. Terry responded that they were uncertain, but believed a couple of hundred bodies lay beyond the ridge, suggesting that Custer might be among them. Benteen insisted that Custer was alive, claiming he was watering his horses at the Bighorn River while they endured this significant siege. Consequently, Terry assigned Benteen to lead a group to investigate the battlefield. Benteen complied, and one of his privates was the first to locate Custer. Benteen dismounted, approached, and exclaimed in disbelief, "My God, it's him!" In that moment, the vindictive hope that Benteen had clung to over the past 2 days, that Custer was out there and that their survival would lead to his downfall, was shattered. Custer had been the Major Joel Elliott, the one who had been forsaken. One could argue that it was Benteen who had abandoned him. The precise circumstances surrounding Custer's death would remain unknown. Lakota and Cheyenne witnesses asserted that he perished early in the battle while attempting to cross the Little Bighorn at a location known as Medicine Tail Coulee. A member of Custer's battalion later claimed to have seen him riding alone along the riverbank. Others contended that he was among the last to fall, making a desperate effort to capture Lakota and Cheyenne non-combatants at the northern edge of the village. The profound enigma surrounding this battle will persist, as all individuals under Custer's direct command met their demise. Numerous Lakota and Cheyenne witnesses were present, yet the chaos of the battlefield, filled with smoke, dust, flying arrows, and panicked horses, created a scene of utter disarray, with a multitude of warriors and troopers exposed amidst the turmoil. Only approximately 100 of them survived. This led to the events that have come to be referred to as the Last Stand, where a mere handful of soldiers found themselves encircled by a vast opposing force. Custer's remains were discovered at the summit of a flat-topped hill, bearing a gunshot wound to his chest and another to his left temple. His brother Tom was found beside him. The bodies of Boston Custer, Audie Reed, and William Cook were located in close proximity. In the early hours of July 6, 1876, the steamboat Far West completed its arduous journey of over 700 miles, arriving at Fort Lincoln with news of the calamity. Although the fort appeared to be at rest, the sound of the steamboat's whistle had already reached Bismarck a few hours prior, ensuring that no one was truly asleep. As a result, they proceeded to Custer's quarters and knocked on the door. Libby, accompanied by her sister-in-law, Custer's sister, descended to receive the news. Libby Custer and 26 other women at the fort were now left as widows. The sorrow experienced by these bereaved women was palpable, as noted by an observer. Their weeping, the torrent of tears, and the overwhelming grief were beyond consolation. As the wife of the commanding officer, Libby felt compelled to provide support to the other women, all while grappling with her own shivering distress despite the heat. Once she fulfilled this obligation, she descended into a profound depression. The disbelief surrounding the annihilation of Custer and his entire 7th Cavalry was palpable. Custer, once celebrated as the boy general and hero of the plains, had been utterly vanquished along with his regiment. How could such a notion possibly hold any truth? It was beyond belief for many. The idea that Custer had been defeated by Native Americans was simply unacceptable to them. Some members of the press even went to the extent of suggesting that Sitting Bull was not truly an Indian. They were unwilling to acknowledge that an Indian or a group of Indians had outsmarted them. There were claims that Sitting Bull must have studied the tactics of Napoleon to achieve victory over Custer, with assertions that he was a spy who had graduated from West Point before returning to the Sioux, ultimately becoming a military strategist of remarkable skill for his people. This led to immediate calls for retribution, prompting the Army of the West to send additional troops in pursuit of the Native Americans. By the autumn of that year, nearly all of the Lakota and Cheyenne were compelled to return to reservations. Only Sitting Bull remained steadfast, residing with his band of 5,000 Lakota in Canada. Meanwhile, debates raged among Americans regarding who bore responsibility for the disaster at the Little Bighorn. President Grant characterized Custer's defeat as an unnecessary sacrifice of troops. In his report, General Terry placed the blame for the disaster directly on the shoulders of the 7th's commander. Even Custer's supporters, Sherman and Sheridan, conceded that he had acted recklessly in attacking such a large contingent of Native Americans. However, one voice stood firm in defending General Custer from blame. Libby Custer faced a pivotal decision regarding her future. Her cousin posed the question of whether she would prefer to be the widow of such a man rather than the wife of another. Ultimately, Libby resolved to seek ways to uphold his legacy as a hero. Libby's supporter and her endeavor to honor her husband's legacy took the form of a dime novelist named Frederick Whitaker. She provided him with access to several of George's personal letters, which he skillfully transformed into a flattering biography of Custer, celebrating his heroic qualities and unwavering bravery. The biography by Whitaker consolidates a disparate collection of narratives found in various newspapers and magazines into a cohesive and authoritative account. As a result, the Custer legend gained a definitive source. In contrast, Marcus Reno, portrayed as the antagonist in Whitaker's narrative, spent the remainder of his life striving to vindicate his reputation. Struggling with alcoholism and ultimately dismissed from military service, he succumbed to complications from throat cancer in 1889. Frederick Benteen continued his military career until he criticized one too many commanders, leading to his expulsion from the Army. He remained unable to escape the shadow of Custer, persistently writing critiques about him for years. While many who participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn appeared haunted by their experiences, one individual from the West managed to profit from it. Just weeks following the news of the massacre, the Western scout and promoter William F. Cody was performing on the New York stage in a melodrama titled Buffalo Bill's First Scalp for Custer. This portrayal quickly elevated Custer to the status of a martyr for the cause of American progress, rendering the narrative more palatable than ever. It is not as though Americans have not made sacrifices, is it? They have indeed given something up. They sacrificed Custer. The more glorified Custer becomes in the wake of his death, the greater the perceived sacrifice, as they continue to dispossess the indigenous peoples of their land. Ultimately, it was Libby who played a pivotal role in enhancing the Custer legend. She transitioned into the role of a grieving widow, a position she did not choose, but one she embraced for the remainder of her life. The figure of the widow holds significant power in American culture. While she was alive, it was nearly impossible to critique her husband. In her 3 memoirs, she depicted her life with George Custer as enchanting, glorious, and honorable. These works became bestsellers and significantly influenced the public's perception of Custer for over 50 years, until Libby's passing in 1933, just 4 days before her 91st birthday. Libby crafted one interpretation of Custer, yet many more interpretations would follow. Custer serves as a lightning rod, an enduring icon. He is inherently linked to the concept of immortality, adapting to the changing times. With each era, he is reimagined. In 1941, Errol Flynn portrayed Custer in They Died with Their Boots On, a film that resonated with Americans who viewed combat through the lens of unwavering bravery in the face of insurmountable odds. Following World War II, particularly during the Vietnam War, the narrative of the last stand was repurposed, most notably in Little Big Man. "Fugitive, sound the charge. We're running out of ammunition, General." This line becomes a rallying cry for critics who depict Custer as deranged, a megalomaniac. Get on your feet and fight. The last stand ultimately serves as a testament to his madness and the irrationality of the entire expansionist imperialist agenda. A hero, often regarded as a myth, serves as a conceptual symbol for reflection. As societal perspectives on race evolve, as our views on Native Americans shift, and as we reassess American history in light of contemporary changes, our understanding of Custer transforms. He transitions from a figure of heroism to one of villainy, from an esteemed commander to a misguided individual. Custer is undeniably flawed. However, it is his ambition and ruthlessness that ensure his place in our collective memory. This narrative can be seen as a dramatic exploration of human character revealed in extraordinary and harrowing situations. The portrayal is not aesthetically pleasing. It rarely is. Custer remains a contentious figure, largely due to the very traits that contributed to his success during his lifetime. He was a larger-than-life character who adeptly utilized the resources at his disposal to craft an identity that encapsulates many uncomfortable aspects of American history. This includes the tendency of Americans to hastily engage in military endeavors and the treatment of Native Americans and other marginalized groups globally. These issues are deeply ingrained and unresolved, prompting ongoing reflection. Until we confront these matters, Custer and the debates surrounding his legacy will continue to resurface. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channels for more engaging historical content.